Welcome back to Talking Point. We're now going to shift the discussion to Professor Patrick Bond from the University of Johannesburg. Of course, he is the Director for Social Change and also an international relations expert. Professor Bond, always good to have you on. Assalamu alaikum. Prof. Bond, you and I have spoken with extent to Washington and Pretoria's soured relations. And I remember you said this is not going to get any sweeter as the months go by. And I think you were spot on. And Donald Trump's announcement that South Africa will not be attending the G20 is probably the cherry on the top.
Alaikum salam. It's great to be back with you, Faraz. And I think the idea that we were trying to promote, which a couple of European embassies did pick up, and they called some of the T20, the think tank 20 advisors, is that Trump should have been expelled first. And that was because of the climate summit withdrawal, the World Health Organization withdrawal, the geopolitical messes that he's been making. For example, just illegal bombings. He's been doing that off the shore of Venezuela, but he did it in Iran. For example, the destruction of world trade, the destruction of other parts of the UN, the UNESCO, and now this week also withdrawing U.S. aid residual funding, which is called PEPFAR, a Presidential Executive Program for AIDS relief from South Africa, about 2 billion rand. This is an exceptionally destructive man who has taken multilateralism, and every time he sees anything progressive or DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion oriented, he wants to end it. And I think we should have earlier on had a G19 vote. In other words, vote Trump off the island. You have 19 states in the G20 plus the EU plus now the African Union. I think probably Trump would only have had Argentina and maybe Saudi Arabia as allies in such a vote. This we should have realized that Donald Trump would have the gall to try to toss South Africa out after President Ramaphosa was really behaving very gently with him, some mild procedural critique at the end of the summit, not doing a handover to the deputy ambassador. I mean, just a fairly trivial symbolic moment. But certainly Donald Trump wants to take anything that's in climate, in food security, in inequality and taxation, anything to do with energy and any of the other, public health, any of the other aspects South Africa entered the G20 to try to make reforms on and toss them out as the G20 moves to Miami next December.
Here's the thing, Prof. Bond. This, and it's a question I asked my previous guest, Ambassador Rasool, on the so-called falsified white genocide that is happening. We've had this discussion before, Prof. Bond. And again, he reiterates it, despite it being debunked so many occasions. And I guess it's a question for you, Prof. Bond. Is it not getting to a point of irritation that this false narrative continues to be peddled and the world must just accept it for what it is?
Well, it's a great question. Why is such a false narrative peddled when even the August 2025 U.S. State Department report on South Africa, their annual report, has the word Afrikaner just 4 times, and it's about a sort of vague threat of expropriation without compensation, no talk of genocide. And there's really obviously a disconnect that can only be explained, in my view, by Donald Trump trying to restore some faith from his MAGA, Make America Great Again, white working class and lower middle class base. And they've been now very, very confused, I think, by the potential that Donald Trump will be unveiled for pedophilia, for child sexual abuse because of the Epstein scandal. There are some rumors that some photos that the FBI have will include Donald Trump with underage girls. So that may come up in the days, the weeks ahead. But certainly Trump does want to always restore, in his reactionary base, let me call it paleo-conservative. That's the word that they use. That means paleo, Stone Age, going back to their basics, which are the power of the white male, and they're being subsequently, from the last 40 years of economic globalization, dethroned as their jobs have been moved abroad. And that's in contrast for us. I'm sure you know the terms neoconservative and neoliberal. And I happen to be in Germany at the moment, and there's a very strong neoliberal but also neoconservative government, like the one that George W. Bush had, and in a way Barack Obama. And then you've got in Britain neoliberal. You've got in France neoliberal. Even some of the BRICS countries, I would argue, are authoritarian and neoliberal, and those are very different. They want to reform the IMF and World Bank and World Trade Organization, as you see in the various statements, and make them even stronger. And Donald Trump, actually, as a paleocon, he's xenophobic, he's protectionist, he's racist, he's Islamophobic, he's misogynist. You can he's a climate denialist. He doesn't want to do any of that. So that's what I see as the big split in the world, the G1, and then you've got a G6, formerly G7, that actually wants to make multilateralism work for global capital. And the BRICS basically are on board that. And when you put the BRICS and the G6 together, there are a few others, Australia, South Korea, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, you put some of them together, and the G20 next year in not Mar-a-Lago, his home, it's very close by, the Doral Golfing Country Club that he owns, and plays some golf with his mates, which is what Ramaphosa had hoped he would do here. So I think for Ibrahim Rasool, who opened up this debate on March 14, the day he was fired by Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, and he said, I think quite correctly, there's a white supremacism out there, and Donald Trump is basically the world leader of that white supremacism, and that means we're actually dealing with somebody who's not going to drop the myth of a white Afrikaner genocide. And the irony is the last point for us, that this man Trump has put on tariffs on the food products like citrus and nuts, the table grapes, also wines. He's taken them off of citrus and nuts, but certainly for those Stellenbosch Afrikaner farmers, they're thinking, hey, he's got our back. Actually, no, he's put tariffs 30%, and you're going to see Afrikaner farmers, your own exports to the U.S. dramatically decline. And that's the problem of Donald Trump being a protectionist. At the same time, he says you're victims of white genocide. It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the thing is that obviously while the US has said that they're not going to be buying the fruits, China has said, well, leave it up to us to go ahead and do that. And Prof, you mentioned something quite interesting about PEPFAR, is that obviously it's quite an important funding for South Africa, given, of course, the battle against HIV and AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria. My question to you is that, can South Africa, I think through its relations with the European Union, supposedly plug that gap that the US has removed?
Possibly, but the crucial question when we're looking at the world trading system being very much frayed and sometimes breaking because of Donald Trump, is that when China then wants to export to the U.S. or Europe does, or even Canada, Mexico, and they find there are now these tariffs, well, where will they move the exports to? What we've seen is China dumping, that is, selling below the cost of production, its excess capacity in steel, in tires, in nuts and bolts, in washing machines. And the result is that South Africa has then had to put tariffs on those products from China because they are technically dumped on South Africa because they don't find that U.S. market anymore. So the tragic sort of ripple effect that Donald Trump is having on world trade, and it should be a time when South Africa and a China and a Brazil hosting the G20. Now it's going to be passed over to Narendra Modi in India, who's also very cross. Both Brazil and India got 50% tariffs, although Brazil's has been reduced a bit. And when you look at this potential for the world uniting against Donald Trump and the BRICS uniting, you kind of shake your head. How has he succeeded in divide and conquer? So we haven't had that unity. We've instead have South Africa putting tariffs against China this year. And these are the tragedies, I think, of a global capitalist system that is very fragmented. And these ideologies that I've mentioned, first, the paleo-conservative, second, the neoliberal, neoconservative unity of the imperial powers, and then third, you've got the multipolar capitalist ideology, but they're just not finding any coherence, and we're seeing a fragmented world and excess production being pushed around and more geopolitical tensions. And even when it comes to something as simple as putting sanctions against Israel, you can't get the G6, certainly not the G1, or the BRICS to agree to put pressure to stop the genocide. So we're really needing to push much harder from below to change those balance of forces.
We've got 2 minutes, Prof. Bond. Obviously the strap we have below, it's saying, can Trump really ban South Africa? It requires majority of the, G20 nations. And given what we saw over that G20 Leaders Summit, it's quite clear that many of the nations, probably stand in favor of South Africa. One can maybe exclude one or two, being Argentina, and we'll touch on that after the break. But when you have Chancellor Merz, and I know you're in Berlin at this moment, really saying to Donald Trump, well, you really can't do that, it kind of shows that Trump may just be isolated in all of this.
Well, we'd hope so, but of course he can do one thing that Merz and Macron, who's also close to Ramaphosa or Starmer, can't stop him from doing, which is to ban the entry of South Africans using his visa power. Yeah. And that's unfortunately what I suspect it might come down to unless conditions change in the next 12 and a half months or so. Now, I think the main question is whether South Africa wants to use its moral stature, and having had a widely understood as successful event from the standpoint of other G20 members, and say, actually, maybe we need to have a G19. We need to go back to a different formulation, and maybe Mexico should host it. I think, you don't need to do that in the Nasrec Center. You can do it now. If Donald Trump is actually going to have maybe a G20 where only one country shows up, that's him, perhaps Argentina, perhaps Saudi Arabia, his two closest allies. We also learned that during the G20 meetings that preceded the summit, that Trump had a great deal of sabotage ongoing. Yeah. And we learned that from a New York Times report. And you'd add to Saudi Arabia and Argentina, also, unfortunately, Turkey, as being part of that sabotage, especially on clean energy and climate. And that's where, of course, Trump is a climate denialist, promoting dirty coal, oil and gas. He wants to keep going, and he wants the G20 just to allow that to happen.
Yeah, Prof, you mentioned something interesting about that New York report. We got about still 2 minutes left. So you said there was Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Argentina. So from that report, when you mentioned sabotage, it was to try and stop the renewable/clean energy being part of the declaration. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, and of course it does go in because it's so obvious, and it's even just for any capitalist knowing that the next lowest price kilowatt of power will come from a combination of solar, perhaps wind, but certainly storage. And we're now seeing a move towards non-lithium batteries, more readily accessible batteries with sodium ion. We have in South Africa pumped storage. You pump it up during the day in the Drakensberg, or Cape Town has Steenbreis, and then you let it come down, and it runs turbines at night or on cloudy days. Those are the sorts of strategies we have to put in everywhere, and it's a tragedy South Africa hasn't got it, and is still going for more next methane gas. And the Parks Tau, the trade minister, wants the United States to supply through ExxonMobil and Conoco that supply of oil and gas to, especially methane gas, to South Africa. So there's a big contestation over whether we build out a huge new infrastructure of methane gas instead of the coal, and retain still, unfortunately, a very high greenhouse gas emissions, because methane is 85 times worse in the next 20 years than CO2 for the potency of greenhouse gases.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Professor Patrick Bond. We're going to be discussing the international isolation that could potentially befall Washington, and the statements from US President Donald Trump doesn't really help in any way possible for the US's diplomacy and international relations. Do stay tuned. We'll wrap up the conversation after the break. Right, this is Talking Point, and of course I'm still in conversation with Professor Patrick Bond. Prof. Bond, the US's international or foreign policy, since Donald Trump had started his second term, kind of is the head scratcher when it comes to the Gulf nations. I want to quote the Proteas head coach, the cricket head coach, Shukri Conrad, as groveling to their feet. When it comes to Israel, probably kissing it rather than groveling the feet. And when it comes to the other nations of the global south, he treats them with a demeanor of arrogance and, quite frankly, looking down upon them. But there was a vote within the United Nations which, of course, spoke of the human rights abuses that we are seeing currently in Palestine, the occupied West Bank, and, of course, Gaza. And there were two nations who voted in favor of with the United States, Argentina and Israel. And I think it's feathers of the same flock. And that's where it is right now. If we were to look at that, Professor Bond, it's quite clear that isolation of Washington is starting to show some sort of a trend.
Well, unfortunately, Trump has been able to use the UN General Assembly, but especially the UN Security Council, where the US is one of just 5 countries that has a veto. We'd hoped when Trump basically anointed himself as the president of Gaza in his peace plan, that, maybe without Tony Blair's assistance as a sort of viceroy, that we would have seen some opposition from other countries in the UN Security Council, but particularly the 2 that have vetoes. They could have vetoed. They abstained. Those are Russia and China. And it just goes to show, doesn't it, that the Palestinian plight really does put the world's peoples with morals, with ethics, with a sense of solidarity, with a sense of historic justice against pretty much all the rulers of the world. The perhaps exception, the one country that really has acted with principle is Colombia. And they're the co-chair of the Hague Group with South Africa. But unlike South Africa, they've actually canceled their coal supply. South Africa, still with Glencore. But I think the main point you're making, the relationship that Trump has built with the Malay, the right-wing paleo-conservative leader of really a libertarian, an economist who's just slashing that budget. Lots of protests, and they had a bailout of about $20 billion from the IMF that the U.S. supported just before their recent election. And Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states, the most dangerous being the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, particularly because of its role now in Sudan, as sort of looting the gold of Sudan to keep that awful civil war going and the mass death and destruction. Now, you kind of put all of this together and think, well, what sort of alternative configuration might we find? Is there any option to move away from the power centers, the UN Security Council, International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization? And there I would go to Samir Amin, the late Egyptian and Senegalese-based economist who argued for a delinking. And I think the best example we've had has been on AIDS medicines, where back about 25 years ago, ignoring the intellectual property and getting generics and spreading them out amongst the society, about 7 million South Africans who live with HIV, and then the life expectancy as a result went from 52 to 65 just before COVID. That's the sort of delinking, and we had that spirit. Let's call it solidarity, equality, and sustainability. We had that spirit in ending apartheid, and we need it obviously for the worst crisis, the climate catastrophe. And again, Donald Trump should be getting climate sanctions. There's a carbon border adjustment mechanism already well established in fact, South Africa will start suffering it from European importers of steel and aluminium on January 1, because we have a very small carbon tax. Here where I am in Europe, it's about 80 euros a ton, South Africa about 38 cents per ton. And that's the sort of politics of using trade as a weapon, not for the political purposes Trump wanted, but to save the planet and to get a more rational distribution of economic activity. And particularly as AI comes up, the artificial intelligence threats, we really do need to protect against cyber currencies and all of the ways in which some of the rogue elements out there, number one being Donald Trump, want to punish South Africa.
Is the jig starting to slowly give up for US President Donald Trump? I ask this question, Prof. Bond, because domestically he's got this crisis with the late Jeffrey Epstein, the allegations that he played a huge role in the sex offenses that Jeffrey Epstein has committed. Then you had the shutdown in the US, which was unprecedented in the US history. And many critics of his says that it was down to Donald Trump really making rash decisions. And then from an international perspective, what we saw in the G20 with President Ramaphosa saying that we will not be bullied. And then you've got the European nations who are, if we look at it on paper, potentially standing with South Africa with regards to the declaration that occurred. In terms of climate, US President Donald Trump has this burn baby burn sort of slogan where he wants to keep fossil fuels and the rest of the world wants to move to green energy. Do you think that's enough to really push back on Donald Trump, given the rhetoric that we have seen from Washington?
Yes, well, there are two processes that do give me some optimism, having done my PhD studies, my studies in the United States. And one of them is indeed that there's a lot of turmoil over Trump including a split in his own MAGA base.
Yes.
The most important member of the Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, has just announced she's quitting. She's splitting from Trump. But also you see right-wing commentators, the most important being Tucker Carlson, splitting from Trump on his support for Israel. But a concern, of course, by many in that far right that the pedophile ring will go unpunished because Trump's part of it. So I think that's one interesting and hopeful split. That is that the continuity of the far right now is in question, and that in turn means that the left may have an opening, and they've been mobilizing there also for optimism. They've had a No Kings movement, the protests, first in June, about 5 million, and then last month about 7 million. And I think that's a very encouraging sign that if there's a midterm in election, which is next November, then Trump's Democratic House opponents will become the majority, possibly in the Senate. And that then starts a whole series of other investigations. His Supreme Court may rule against him in coming weeks on the tariffs question, because it's the Congress that's meant to set the tariffs, not Donald Trump. He said, well, it's an emergency. I must save industry. But no one really buys that. And I think in all those ways, and many more, we're still to come, Trump's perhaps his own mental capacities in decline, and his own ability to exude strength when he's allowing so many things to fall apart. Inflation now ticking up, very, very weak employment growth in the U.S. So the promises that Trump made to the MAGA, to the Make America Great Again base of especially white working class men who are down and out, those promises clearly broken. And I think there could be continuing splits and revolts from the right side, and hopefully more unity. I mean, the best single indicator that you can put together class politics and identity politics with a Muslim leader, unheard of when I was doing my studies in the United States about 40 years ago, is Zoran Mamdani, who did spend some formative years here in South Africa, in Cape Town especially.
St. George's Grammar, to be precise. Yeah, he went to St. George's Grammar School.
And he was also a little toddler in Durban. His father, a great political scientist, Mahmoud, was teaching at what was then UDW. So we have a little bit of a stake. And I think in that sense, we've given the world Elon Musk. Okay, well, we've got to give more than Trevor Noah and Tyler and Charlize Theron's wonderful. That Zoran Mamdani has become our latest export.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. Prof. Bond, just your overall view, because we've got about 4 to 5 minutes on this. South Africa's G20 presidency, do you feel it was a victory for multilateralism? Because, of course, multilateralism is the very same concept that Donald Trump really wants to avoid in his G20 presidency and, of course, United States foreign policy as a whole.
Right. I think we have to then dig into the next layer. And what I would do then, if you allow me, Faraz, is to say
no problem.
Multilateralism has either the G6 version, neoliberalism and neoconservatism, where it's still a Western unipolar orientation. That is, that the IMF and the World Bank are led by, respectively, a European and a U.S. leader. And then there's the World Trade Organization, which now is being led by a Nigerian. Her name, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and she's very neoliberal. She comes straight out of the World Bank and the Nigerian finance ministry. We don't really tell any difference in our attempts, to get COVID-19 off of intellectual property so that the vaccines and the treatments could be spread the way AIDS medicines were spread, failed partly because of her. So I don't see, unfortunately, the multipolar challenge to either paleo-conservatism, Trump, the G1, or the neoliberal, neoconservative G6. I don't see it doing anything different. If you look at the BRICS latest statement, which was from Brazil in their July summit, they simply want to strengthen these institutions as they are. There's no real reform to the underlying ideology of corporate power. China's probably worst along those lines, and they didn't join South Africa or India when COVID-19 was, subject to global public good solution, generic vaccines, generic treatments. We unfortunately didn't see China or Russia because they had their own vaccines joining. And that's, I think, the epitome of the splits within the BRICS. Some of the BRICS are moving in that neoliberal direction. Others, like Iran, just desperate to survive under sanctions. Russia under economic sanctions and especially dollar sanctions. And yet the BRICS haven't put together the much needed, overdue de-dollarization. So when I look at multilateralism, can we call the G20 a success? No, it didn't address that problem of the excessive power of the dollar on something as important as food security. It ignored the kinds of critiques from below, like land reform wasn't even mentioned, or organic agriculture and agroecology. They were just left out. Or on the international finance, the crucial question, are there odious debts? Are there corrupt loans? Medupi, Kusile, the Transnet locomotives, our three biggest sets of loans, corrupted, no question about that. They shouldn't be repaid. Or for changing the climate system, can we get polluters to pay? That is a climate debt. G20 is no use at all because those are the biggest polluters. So I would look at this multilateralism project within the G20 as combining the imperial powers, G1 and G6, right, the West, with the sub-imperial breaks that basically cohere on those terribly important points and occasional disruptions like Ukraine war. But, on, for example, supporting Israel economically, all G20 members, including the BRICS, are deeply involved. South Africa, among them, with our massive exports of coal, 2 million tons already since the genocide began. So you see, there's more in common with the G7 leaders, the BRICS leaders, and their corporations and banks and their interests on the one hand, and all the rest of us and our planetary survival on the other.
Prof. Bon, always a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum.
Salam. Alaikum salam.
That's Professor Patrick Bon from the University of Johannesburg, Director for Social Change and also International Relations expert. Well, that's all we have for you here on Talking Point from myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. If you have missed today's episode, you will find it on our YouTube channel. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.